The November 2021 election results are in. I'm Cecily Fernandez, and this is a Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Cecily Fernandez. Joining us today are Libertarian and Senior Fellow at the CATO Institute, Doug Bandow. Doug.
Hello, Cecily. Hope you're having a good week.
I am, thank you. Conservative Jennifer Kabbany of the College Fix. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime.
And progressive political reporter, James Rosen. James, wonderful to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Americans across the nation went to the polls this past Tuesday, weighing in on everything from statewide offices and mayoral races to defunding the police. James, let's start with you. What's your big takeaway from Republican Glenn Youngkin's major upset in Virginia?
I'm not really completely surprised for several reasons. I think Terry McAuliffe did not run a good campaign, number one, and he obviously stepped on it with his comment, which he was recorded making about parents, an idiotic statement about parents shouldn't be involved with their kids' education, which is going to, anger about 90% of all parents, regardless of their political persuasion. And then when he had a chance to walk it back and apologize and just repudiate what he said, he didn't do that. So that was the big mistake, but there was also more going on. He was governor already for one term. Virginia has a term limits their governors to, you can't have two consecutive terms. I personally am not a fan of term limits. I think experience matters, but that's a totally separate debate. That is Virginia's law. And I think one of the less reported aspect of this is that he still was running for a second term. And Virginians have made it clear, that they, majority of them support term limits. They don't want a governor for a second term. And I think that probably cost him, just that alone, probably cost him enough votes to make the difference. And then Youngkin ran a very disciplined campaign.
Jennifer, what do you think? What's your big takeaway from the election in Virginia?
Well, I absolutely agree with James that Youngkin ran a fabulous campaign. And he really resonated with voters. I think he was down to earth and I think he was likable. But I think this issue really boiled down to a couple of key factors. Number one, education. Look, I don't live in Virginia, but I can imagine the drama at the Loudoun County school boards was all over the state of Virginia's local news. And for a while there, it was every day we were seeing these parents descend on this school board meeting. They were angry, they were frustrated. And that probably trickled down into a lot of local Virginia news and it stuck with people and it stuck with parents. Don't upset a soccer mom, all right? She's a mama bear and she wants to protect her cubs. So I think education was a major factor in Youngkin's victory. But I also have to believe that the economy, remember, it's the economy, stupid, remember, but the inflation is through the roof. Gas prices are through the roof, milk prices, egg prices. I think people are tired of paying so much money for stuff under Trump. Frankly, they were paying much less for. So that had to be a factor as well. I think, we're exporting energy now. Our borders are completely porous. Meanwhile, the Democrats, all they want to do is talk about spending trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. At the end of the day, this was a repudiation of the Biden administration and the far left radical agenda that's frankly taken control of Congress for the most part over the last year.
Doug, what do you think are the issues that made the difference in Virginia?
I think there are two general factors. The first is this is an off-year election, and Virginia traditionally has provided that opportunity that people, if they're angry, they're frustrated, fewer of them turn out. You sometimes get the other party doing well. And I think that's there. And I think that what Jennifer mentioned, clearly these issues have been resonating against the Biden administration. I don't think all of these are their fault, but they haven't handled it very well. And they've created the impression of incompetence. And that is just deadly. That whether you like them or don't like them in terms of ideology, you want them to be competent. And you start getting this feeling that they really aren't quite there. Whether it's foreign policy, whether it's domestic, it's prices, it's Capitol Hill. So I think that played a role. Hard to know how many people voted on that, but I suspect that discouraged some Democratic voters. There were probably some of them just were not as motivated. And I think playing into that is McAuliffe was not an impressive candidate. I mean, his background is a bit more of the political type. That I mean, his gubernatorial time was not bad, but he is running again. People like to have something different. And he did make those gaffes that James talked about that I think the educational is extraordinarily bad. So that I think is one set of factors. The second is that Youngkin just demonstrated that normal Republicans can win. And this has been the challenge for Republicans. If you're going after the orange man and you're part of the cult, I mean, normal people won't vote for you. And that's why Republicans lost Congress in 2018, because soccer moms and a lot of folks just said, I can't vote for this guy, and they wanted to punish him. They punished him by punishing the Republican Party. On the other hand, it's very hard for a never Trumper to win if you're pushing away I mean, a lot of folks who do like Donald Trump. And Youngkin showed that he could be a normal person, likable, talk about serious issues, a lot of them traditional Republican bread and butter issues, education and other things. And he found a way to kind of accept the endorsement of Trump without offending, his voters. And that was the critical thing. And he was helped by Trump on that. And I don't know if it was intentional. I was imagining till the end that, Donald was going to show up and kind of mess everything up. They didn't. I mean, it got played very well. And I think Youngkin clearly had a game plan. He recognized it was working. He stuck with it. So then it gives Republicans hope for next year that you can do this, that you can speak to normal voters, you can be a normal person, you can find a way still to appeal to some of those kind of rougher and tougher, Trump supporters, and you might very well win. And next year is an off-year election from the standpoint of the president. It could be rough on Democrats, and they're getting very nervous now.
Let's move on to another interesting race, the unexpectedly close governor's race in New Jersey. Keeping in mind that President Biden won that state by 16 points. James, what do you make of that race?
In off-year elections, especially in the first off-year election of a new president, it tends to be voters tend to want to go in the other direction, and I think that's part of what happened. And then the economy doesn't help. Folks said President Trump's supporters, when there were so many economic problems, partially caused by the pandemic last year, largely caused by the pandemic, Trump supporters said the president doesn't control the economy. There's forces that go beyond the presidency. And now, of course, they're making it sound like President Biden is directly to blame. But I mean, one thing that he could do, which I still think he has not done, is that the container ships stuck at port in Los Angeles and Long Beach, I believe, out in California, which have been stuck there for weeks and weeks. He could call in the National Guard and have them start unloading those ships. He mentioned that as a possibility. I heard him mention that at a town hall as a possibility 2-3 weeks ago. He still hasn't done it. So that would be an easy fix. It would be a popular fix. It would help the economy, and he could kind of brag on it. So I'm just kind of puzzled why he hasn't taken even obvious steps. But I think also the anti-incumbent, the natural anti-incumbent tendency in off-year elections hurt Murphy, along with the fact that he's already been governor. So,
Jennifer, what do you think about New Jersey, even given the incumbency issue that James is talking about? Still, New Jersey considered very blue. So what do you make of the race being so tight?
Yeah, so everybody thought that Murphy was going to win by a landslide. They thought there was no contest, and he eked it out barely by a couple thousand votes. I think that should be a huge wake-up call. for the Democrats in New Jersey. It shows that people are sick and tired of the Democratic agenda. You know, their nannyism, their paternalism, their control from the COVID regulations to, I imagine New Jersey's got a lot of union workers there. And maybe they're not thrilled with how everybody's getting fired because of Murphy's onerous regulations. So this is the grassroots people speaking up and saying, enough is enough. Your policies aren't helping our feed our family and keep our lights on and keep a roof over our head and helping us make the American dream. At the end of the day, that's what it's really all about. And if Murphy was doing a good job at that, he would have won handedly, but he didn't. And I also should mention that there were a ton of upsets in the smaller races. I was reading some New Jersey papers today, and a lot of school board races. There were a ton of upsets on these local elections. And then even you probably heard about the one guy who beat the state Senate representative. He only spent a couple $1,000s on his campaign. You know, the powerhouse politician Democrat spent, you know, over $1 million, and the truck driver won. You know, the GOP truck driver won. So it just goes to show you, I honestly think people in New Jersey, people in Virginia, and we'll find out, are people in America just tired of a far left policies that just don't get our country anywhere? You know, people are trying to say with regard to Virginia and to a certain extent New Jersey, well, oh, this was because these were the Trump voters and they still love Trump. And they're actually, I don't think this really had anything to do with Trump. I think every election we saw on Tuesday night had to do with politics is local, and everything is local, whether it was your school board, whether you're at risk of losing your job, whether you can't afford to put gas in your tank, whether you're tired of seeing, you know, people prioritize more illegal immigrants coming to this country rather than, you know, citizens, or we're dying of opioid and, you know, frustrated and jobless. That's what this was really all about. That's why Democrats saw such sweeping defeats on Tuesday.
Doug, what did you make of the tight race in New Jersey? Is that something that surprised you?
It really didn't surprise me. I mean, there were some Republicans who were in the state who were talking about it could be closer than people were expecting. I think a couple of things are going on. I think one of them is Republicans have had a couple of bad years of elections in, say, northeastern states with Trump. So we've seen a lot of pickups. I mean, some city council seats in New York City. The socialist who won the primary in Buffalo for mayor lost to the incumbent, ran a write-in campaign with the support of Republicans. Even in San Francisco on the school board, a couple of the hard left who were kind of focusing on name changes were tossed out by really kind of progressives. I mean, in San Francisco, it's very much kind of the left versus progressives. I mean, the progressives were saying we want to focus on education. So there's a certain amount, I think, of ferment, but especially in the Northeast, of people, Republicans that had bad years. They picked up a couple of the countywide seats on Long Island, Staten Island. They did very well on. I mean, so you saw a revival in some of these. And I think part of that is with Trump in office in these areas, they typically did badly. So that, I think, helped them. The second is that New Jersey, of course, had a Republican governor 4 years ago. I mean, Chris Christie was a two-termer. So it's not as if New Jersey doesn't elect Republicans. They haven't had a senator for a while. But they've often had some close races. So, that there was always that sense if you had the right person. And I think in this case, they had the right person. He was an ethnic, a long-time, kind of state house member, seemed quite personable. I mean, his statement at on election night, you got a sense this is somebody who was very New Jersey, that he was a good candidate for that state. And Murphy turned out to be, very progressive, more so than recent Democrats. And I think that toss in some of the frustration on COVID restrictions, along with some of the moves that he was taking that, again, you think labor union, working people, blue collar. I mean, there are some of those folks, the moment you start getting into these cultural issues, they may be with you on economic issues, but the moment you get into some of these other things, they get very uncomfortable. So I think all of that came together, and there's probably a lower voter turnout. Again, an off-year election, that's one of the things that often happens. And I suspect that Murphy was overconfident. I mean, it's one of the problems where you have lots and lots of great polls is, well, why should I bother, right? I mean, I'll go out and make my speech, but, he doesn't work as hard. The party doesn't work as hard. They don't raise as much money. There are people out there, I don't need a vote, I'm busy today or something. So I suspect all of that came together. But that's, in many ways, if I was a Democrat, that's the race that would make me more nervous. Virginia, at one point was a red state and kind of went, it was blue, purple, red, purple, and blue. Now it looks like it's at least purple again. But New Jersey's one everybody's thinking should be a Democratic state. So if you have that kind of a scare, that's the one that I think people start getting nervous about. And then they look at some of these other Northeast pickups. That tells them that people are already talking about some of the Senate seats next year that were expected to be blue that might be more toss-up. That there's always a recalibration in terms of congressional seats that might be vulnerable. So there are a lot of people, and I think especially Democrats are going to be sitting down looking at those electoral maps and thinking strategy, because they can't afford to lose very much or they lose both houses of Congress.
Well, picking up on the idea of strategy, one of the issues that came up in various ways in various elections was the issue of defunding the police. With voters in Minneapolis voted 57% not to replace their police department. Eric Adams, a former police officer, will be the next mayor in New York City. So do you think that this election should signal to the Democrats to move away from defunding the police?
Let me jump in on that. Both from you, Cecily, and from other folks, particularly Jennifer, there's constant references to the Democrats. As we've been discussing and as we see, the Democrats, for good and for bad, are not unified. There's a lot of difference within the party. I think in Minneapolis, they tried locally not to use the phrase defund the police. I said on this program last year several times that defund the police was a stupid, toxic slogan that should never be uttered again, no matter how often you try to explain it. I'm not sure they use that, but it's if changing, if making police officers, what do they call them, peace officers or whatever they were going to call them, it was going to work. It was going to work in Minneapolis because number one, it's a liberal city, and number two, it's where George Floyd was murdered. So if it was going to work anywhere, it would have worked there. It didn't. So, but I just want to push back a little bit again. The Democrats, Jennifer keeps mentioning their far left agenda. That's what opponents of Obamacare, now called Obamacare, said about Obamacare when he tried to get it passed, barely did, got it passed without a Republican vote. It's now extremely popular, and the Republicans have failed something like 50,000 times to repudiate it. And the same thing happened, I'm a political history major a long time ago, same thing happened with Lyndon Johnson's Medicare program. He was called socialist. FDR's Social Security program, he was called a socialist by opponents. So these kind of cliches, I really think Jennifer is very smart. I really think you should try a little harder to just not use easy cliches that have been used, throughout our political history, and to talk more substantively when history shows that programs that Democrats supported going back decades that were called socialist at the time are now literally sacrosanct. And so I will list Social Security, I will list Medicare, I will list Obamacare. And my prediction is that some of the things in this so-called massive spending bill, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I'm not going to mention specific examples, will also be sacrosanct.
Well, if I'm allowed to use the term Democrats, and I appreciate where James is coming from, certainly there's nuance in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party. There's some kind of hardcore progressives, and then there's a more moderate Democrats. And I would suggest that some of the more moderate Democrats actually are the reason why Youngkin was elected and the reason why Murphy had such a hard time in New Jersey. So you're right. There's everybody has kind of a different place they fall on the spectrum. When it comes to the situation in Minneapolis, also it's a nuanced situation in the sense that who can't relate to the idea that, if you're having a domestic disturbance or some sort of argument and somebody comes in guns blazing, maybe adding fuel to the fire. I can understand that too. But at the end of the day, the slogan that supposedly killed this measure was, who's going to answer the phone when you call 911? And from what I understand, that was what resonated with voters in Minneapolis. When you call 911, you want somebody who can save your life answer at the other end.
I think what happened here was that there was a fairly strong activist agenda, which was pushed much further than most Americans, including, frankly, most Democrats. That what you the term that was used was defund the police. And I remember there was a New York Times op-ed last year where somebody said, "Oh yes, we mean defund the police." And I read that thinking, they're nuts. I mean, the New York Times had a wonderful report talking to people in poor neighborhoods saying, no, we need the police. Now we want them reformed. I mean, we have issues, but we're overrun by crime. We need the police. And I think that's what happened here was that, as Jennifer said, police reform is very important. I mean, I'm an opponent of qualified immunity. I think it's quite problematic. I think there are things that one should do in terms of how do you try to get better policing, more protective of minorities, making sure, that you don't have some of the incidents that we've had. But my goodness, if there's a burglar in my house, I don't want a counselor. I want a police officer. And I think the problem was that having the slogan become the kind of meme basically made it almost impossible to pass anything that you apply that label to.
Let's move on to some questions from our viewers. James McLaughlin asks, how much of a role do you think critical race theory played in the elections? And I'll go to you, James, first.
I have to be honest, and I'm probably going to be showing my ignorance. I don't really even exactly know what critical race theory is. I kind of have a vague idea what it is. This is going to be a controversial statement. Race relations and either overt or covert racism is always a factor in American relations. It has been going back to our founding. It's worse in some states than other states. But again, this is just like defund the police. This is a phrase that even if you don't know what it means, it sounds overly intellectual. It sounds theoretical. It's kind of egghead. It's not a phrase that you can win elections on. This is something that Bill Clinton, realized brilliantly in his politics. You can't try to explain complicated things. Unfortunately, that's his famous phrase. It's the economy, stupid. And so I don't know how much in the end, I don't know how much of a factor it was in various relations, but it certainly gave opponents of Democrats another phrase to repeat over and over again, and have some people misunderstand it.
Jennifer, particularly in Virginia, do you think that critical race theory played a role in Youngkin's victory?
Yes, I do. And there was some exit polling that Virginians were asked about critical race theory, and they did express knowledge about it, concern about it, and said it impacted their vote. So there's some exit polling that shows it was a factor. In terms of critical race theory being, a talking point in our political lexicon right now, I can say I think it circles back to when we shut down the schools in March of 2020. Everything went online, and the parents were listening to what their students were taught. Whether you call it critical race theory or culturally responsive teaching or whatever you want to call it, essentially it's the same idea that America is irredeemably racist, that there are the oppressors and the oppressed, that the only solution is equity of outcomes, that white privilege is real and the biggest problem facing students of color today, et cetera, all these kind of concepts. And parents are saying, this isn't what I'm sending my kid to school to learn.
I think the issue here goes beyond just education. That even if people don't know the nuances of critical race theory, it is, as Jennifer indicated, it's one more bit of woke culture, cancel culture. People they want to tear down now Thomas Jefferson's statue. They want to rename schools that are named after Washington. There's that perception that this is part of a full-scale attack kind of on the American idea, the American founding, where people would say, we know we have problems. It's evident. We had a civil war. We had problems, but there's that feeling that an unwillingness to acknowledge, despite its faults, that America has something unique to offer. So I think the problem on this, it did have resonance because it clearly hit education, be that sense of, well, what are you doing with time with my kids? But I think it also reinforced this larger feeling that there are folks out there that are just tearing America down. They didn't like it. And that those things have real emotional power, and I think motivate people to vote.
Okay, another great question from Geneva Carr. She asks, if Trump is active in the 2022 campaign, will he help or hurt the GOP as a whole? James, what do you think about the Trump factor?
People talk about how disciplined President Trump was to stay on, to not come and campaign for now Governor-elect Youngkin. I would love to be a fly on the wall and know what Youngkin's people, maybe Youngkin himself, said to President Trump to keep him out of Virginia, because I can't believe that President Trump, given his personality, made that decision on his own. I think they pushed back hard, and said, if you can come here, but Governor Youngkin, I am not going to campaign with you if you come here. Thank you for your endorsement. I'll brag about it, but please don't come here. And so I think a lot depends on, how active President Trump is next year and how directly he campaigns with Republican candidates, particularly in the Senate and the House. And I think what we will see is in more, he'll campaign in more conservative states and districts, and he won't campaign in the more liberal ones. And then the key will be the swing districts. And I think we'll see different reactions from different Republican incumbents and challengers as to whether they want him to come. So, the short answer to your question is it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. And also, there's going to be a lot that's going to happen in the next year. And if his social media, what is it called? Truth Social platform doesn't take off, he may want more attention. He may want a campaign. So there's a lot that's going to happen between now and then.
Jennifer, where do you see Trump figuring into the 2022 campaign? Obviously, Youngkin kind of managed a fine line in his campaign. Do you think that will be kind of the template for other people who are running in 2022?
Well, I can say as a conservative, I hope so, because I'll admit I voted for Trump, but he is just unfortunately so toxic. I mean, the policies that he implemented were clearly popular because people want to get back to the Trump economy and the Trump smaller government, right? The Trump exporting oil. So the things that were working well under Trump, I think people miss, but I don't think they miss Trump. And even somebody who voted for him can honestly say, it's been refreshing. It's kind of a nice change of pace. I think personally, I think DeSantis has kind of stepped up as the leader of the GOP in a way, more than Mitch McConnell, who everybody's kind of sick and tired of that old man. But Ron DeSantis is the kind of guy that offers this energy, the statesmanship, this sort of like chutzpah. He's kind of like the Trump we wish we had. So if anybody's, helping get Republicans elected in 2022, I actually personally hope it's DeSantis. And I think, Trump should look, I appreciate everything he did for this country. I'll say, James, don't get mad at me. I'm just going to nebulous. They tried to destroy his life, and they're still trying to destroy it.
The Democrats didn't like him, and they don't like him. Some non-Democrats clearly don't like him either. So.
That's true. Fair enough. So at any rate, all I can say is that, Trump, let's hope and pray, whoever told him to stay away, maybe it was Ivanka, who knows? Well, I hope they still have sway over him in 2022. I appreciate what he did for the country, but it's time to move on.
I think Jennifer is going to be highly disappointed. It's one thing in an election where two states are up with statewide races. Most of the races are almost invisible local races where, he would not deign to show up. Next year, it will be congressional races, Senate races. His enemies will be up after Kinzinger said he wasn't going to run again. 2 down, he said, 8 to go. He has enemies he wants to purge from the Republican Party. He wants the Republicans to make the stolen election the campaign issue. He cannot resist. I don't care what anybody tells him. This is his chance to grab the spotlight. This is his chance to make his case. Oh my goodness, he's going to jump on this. Oh, no. He's going to be out there. And even if you don't want him to come, he'll come to your state. So you'll be a Republican Congress. You're running for Congress in Northern Virginia, and he's going to be barnstorming down south. And the Washington Post is going to be filled with stories about it. Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer. You're going to be very, very upset next year.
Okay, I guess time will tell. We'll see what kind of factor Trump is in 2022. But for now, it's time for the most underreported story. So much election news. Maybe there were some other stories. Who would like to go first for the most underreported story of the week?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Pfizer just got approved by the FDA vaccines for younger kids, I think down to the age of 5, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Moderna has not been approved. And, since the beginning of the amazing historic vaccine rollout, which I'll give President Trump some credit here, he played a big role in. I think any president would have, but he played a big role. Okay. Since the beginning of the historic development and distribution of the vaccines, Pfizer has been portrayed and considered by a lot of folks as the leading vaccine, and it came out first. And yet there are recent studies that show, that much to my surprise, because I got the Pfizer vaccine, that show that the Moderna vaccine is much more effective than the Pfizer vaccine, even though both have extremely good track records, 98, 99% against infection. But that in terms of the number of antibodies that against COVID that each vaccine produces, I think I saw one study that Moderna produces twice as many antibodies and they last longer than the Pfizer vaccine. So I'm a little bit befuddled. I'm not a scientist. There must be reasons, but I'm a little bit befuddled again why Pfizer is getting approved for young kids before Moderna.
Okay. All right, Jennifer, do you have an underreported story of the week for us?
Well, I hope I'm not in trouble, Cecily, but it is election related. I thought we had okay. I was going in with the theme. So I have this article that it's probably too bright. Well, anyways, it's a 19-year-old who saw senior year disrupted by COVID shutdowns, unseats incumbent in school board race. So essentially this young kid from New Jersey really wasn't super thrilled with losing his senior year, thought there were other ways to have addressed some of the concerns, the health concerns. And you know what he did about it? He ran for school board. And I just thought that was kind of neat. He won handedly by a 17-point margin. And he's maintained a completely positive campaign. And granted, he had been a student representative on the school board in high school. So he had some experience. He obviously is sort of a politician in the making. But I just thought it was kind of neat to show that Americans can still make a difference, that they can see something that they want to solve or be a part in or be a solution for, and go out there and campaign. His Instagram shows him knocking on doors and taking pictures with signs and really trying to be part of the solution. And he won. He unseated an incumbent. So good props to him. His name is Nicholas Seppi, and I hope he has a good term on the school board.
Yes, definitely someone to watch for the future. Doug, what about you? Do you have an underreported story of the week for us?
Well, I'm going to go overseas because I like international stuff. And there's been a lot of interest in Europe about the rise of the populist right there, which preceded Trump, which he kind of played into. And there's some very interesting contrary trends that are going on. There's a lot of nervousness. Next year is a presidential election in France, and the hard right is likely to make the runoff, conceivably could win. So there's a lot of kind of questions about that. But relatively recently, we've seen the Austrian chancellor lose his job because of corruption allegations. Now his party is still the dominant party in government, but he was a young kind of up and comer. We saw the prime minister of Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, Czechia, I guess they also call it now, who was kind of a populist businessman who lost by a very narrow margin. Some of the similar allegations made about him. And they, in Hungary, they came up with a consensus candidate against Orban for prime minister, who is a conservative. I mean, but not kind of an authoritarian. And this is somebody who he can run on some of the social issues, is very traditional in his attitudes, but also liberal in the sense of seeking to have an open political society and democracy. And there are interesting challenges arising even in Poland, where the former prime minister, who was an EU president for a while, went back to Poland and has kind of revived the opposition there. So we might be seeing some real changes in Europe, on the populism front. So over the next year or two, might see a number of shifts there and might see move back to more traditional governance.
Right. We'll see if there's also some interesting election results overseas as well. But that's all the time we have this week. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for watching or listening to the Square Circle. I'm Cecily Fernandez. We'll see you next week.